The wine glass shook. Not a little. It trembled so hard the deep red liquid crept up the side and spilled, just a drop, onto the white tablecloth. And in that room, in that restaurant, a single drop of wine on white linen was the kind of thing that could end a career. Ilya Rowan steadied his hand. He told himself to breathe. Slow. Even. He told himself the weight pressing into his lower back was just fatigue. That the heat crawling up his neck was just the kitchen. That the three men staring at him from across the table were just customers. Just men. Just another table. He told himself a lot of things that night. The restaurant was called Voss and Cole. One of those places in Gangnam where the chandeliers cost more than most people's rent and the menu had no prices because if you had to ask, you didn't belong. Every server wore pressed ivory vests. Every surface gleamed. The kind of place where silence was a status symbol and loud breathing was an offense. Ilya moved through it like a ghost who hadn't figured out he was supposed to disappear. His uniform vest was buttoned all the way up. On purpose. It concealed what 7 months of pregnancy had done to his frame. The swell, the weight, the undeniable evidence that his body had been carrying something the world had already decided it had no right to carry. He had learned to move carefully. Calculated steps. No sudden turns. Lean just enough to reach the table without giving anything away. Hi viewers, if you found out your warning was being ignored while your life was on the line, would you keep trying to save the people who refused to listen? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. The three men at table 7 didn't look like regular customers. They didn't look at menus. They didn't make small talk. They sat in a silence that felt planned, coordinated. Like 3 instruments waiting for a conductor. Identical in the way that only biology could manufacture. Same jaw. Same dark eyes. Same way of occupying a room like they'd already decided it belonged to them. The Dakarai triplets. Kaler, Zion, and Amari. Alpha kings of the Eastern Commerce District. The kind of names whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal fear. Ilya had not been assigned to their table. He had volunteered. Because 40 minutes ago, when he had gone to reset the table setting before their arrival, he had seen something beneath the far edge of the tablecloth, pressed against the underside of the table's mahogany base. Small, flat, black, the kind of thing that didn't belong in a restaurant. The kind of thing that, if Ilya's instincts were worth anything, meant someone in this room was not here to eat. He had not touched it. He had walked back to the service corridor. He had stood there for 11 seconds trying to figure out who to tell. And then he had realized, no one in that restaurant was going to listen to a visibly pregnant Omega server with a rumored connection to a collapsed crime family. Not tonight. Not in this place. Not about something like this. So he did the only thing he could think of. He picked up the wine and walked back to the table himself. Now he stood there, bottle in hand, pulse hammering behind his ears, and leaned slightly toward the closest of the 3 brothers. Kaler, the one at the head of the table who hadn't blinked once since Ilya walked over. Ilya's voice came out barely above a breath. Look under your table. 3 words. That was all. He straightened up, reached across, finished pouring the wine with a hand that would not stop shaking. Nobody moved. Kaler's jaw shifted. Once, like he was chewing on the sound of it. Zion's eyes flicked toward Ilya for exactly half a second before returning to his phone. Amari didn't even look up. The table around them kept moving. Silverware clinked. Low conversations threaded through the room. A woman laughed too loud near the bar. The world kept going. And Ilya stood there, holding a wine bottle, wondering if those 3 words had landed anywhere at all. Or if they'd dissolved into the air like everything else he'd ever tried to say in rooms full of people who'd already decided he didn't matter. He turned to walk back toward the service corridor. And then he heard it. A soft sound. Barely anything. Like the edge of a shoe scraping the floor beneath table 7. Ilya didn't turn around. But his whole body went cold. Something was moving under that table, and it wasn't him. The murmur started at the bar. It always started there, where the servers refilled their trays and the assistant managers pretended not to gossip. Ilya caught pieces of it as he moved past. He always caught pieces. Why is he even still working here? You see the uniform? Can barely button it. I heard the father is connected to the Sohn family. Mafia blood. Every bit of it. Carrying a bastard pup in a place like this. The nerve. Ilya kept walking. He had learned that stopping gave them more. Slowing down gave them more. Even flinching, a tiny tightening around the eyes, gave them something to feed on. So he moved like he hadn't heard a single word. Smooth steps, straight back, tray balanced, face calm as still water. Inside, it was a different thing entirely. Inside, his mind was running hard, replaying the sound he'd heard beneath table 7, measuring it against every logical explanation he could find. A dropped fork, a shoe shifting on the floor, the building settling, anything reasonable. Anything that would let him breathe normally again. But logic kept losing, because the sound had been deliberate, not accidental, not random. There was weight behind it, intention, the kind of small controlled movement that someone makes when they're trying very hard not to be noticed. And in Ilya's experience, people who were trying not to be noticed in places like Voss and Cole were never there for good reasons. He refilled water glasses at table 3 without spilling a drop. Handed a dessert menu to the couple at table 9 with a small, professional nod. Made it back to the corridor, set down his tray, pressed one hand flat against the wall, and just stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. 7 months. He was 7 months along, and his feet hurt and his back hurt and his ribs were slowly being rearranged from the inside, and he was standing in the service corridor of a restaurant where half the staff thought he was a liability and the other half thought he was a cautionary tale. And somewhere in that dining room, beneath a table occupied by 3 of the most powerful alphas in the district, there was something that was not supposed to be there. And he had tried to warn them. He had looked Kaler Dakarai in the face and said 3 words, and gotten nothing back but silence. Ilya breathed out slow through his nose. His mother used to say that silence wasn't always rejection. Sometimes silence was a person trying to catch up to something they weren't ready to understand yet. You plant the seed, baby, she used to say, in that low, warm voice that smelled like flour and something sweet. You don't control when it grows. He had planted the seed. Now he had to keep working. He picked up his tray, pushed through the corridor door, stepped back into the golden light of Voss and Cole's dining room, and immediately felt something different in the air. It was hard to name. A shift in temperature. The way certain conversations had gone quieter. The way 2 men near the entrance, men he hadn't seen come in, were standing just slightly too still for customers. Ilya's eyes moved carefully across the room without his head turning. Table 7. The triplets were still seated, still composed, but something in Kaler's posture had changed. A stiffness across the shoulders that hadn't been there before. Zion's phone was face down now. Amari had his hands flat on the table. They'd heard him. Maybe. Or maybe they were reacting to something else entirely. Something Ilya couldn't see from where he was standing. He crossed toward table 11 to check on the older couple he'd been assigned. And as he passed table 7 without looking directly at it, he caught the edge of something in his peripheral vision. One of the brothers, he couldn't tell which, had shifted slightly in his seat, leaned back a fraction, and for just a moment, the tablecloth lifted on the far side. Ilya kept walking. He did not stop, did not slow down, did not give any outward sign that his heart had just slammed into the back of his ribs. Because in that half-second window, in that brief flutter of white linen, he had seen a shadow beneath the table that was not a chair leg. It was still there, and now he was certain it had moved. There are things a person learns to carry, not because they chose to, not because it's fair, but because the alternative, putting it down, isn't always an option when the floor beneath you keeps shifting and everything you need to protect is already riding on your back. Ilya knew what people saw when they looked at him tonight. He knew it the same way you know when a room has decided something about you before you open your mouth. He saw it in the way the other servers gave him just a little more space than necessary. In the way certain managers walked past his station without stopping to check in. In the way even some of the regular customers let their eyes drag over him. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a particular kind of curiosity. The kind that strips a person down to their most visible facts and stops there. Pregnant. Omega. Alone. That was the story they'd written. Neat and done and already closed. What they didn't see, what none of them could see from the outside, was that the pregnancy wasn't weakness. It was the one clear reason Ilya had left to keep being careful. Keep showing up. Keep making the right call even when every wrong call would have been easier. He was not carrying a burden. He was carrying a reason. His mother had understood that distinction. She was gone now. 3 years ago, a Tuesday, a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers. But her voice had never fully left. It lived in the back of his thoughts like a compass that worked even when everything else was spinning. You are not weak because you feel, she had told him once, when he was 11 years old and had cried in front of a classroom full of kids who'd laughed at him for it. She had knelt down and put both flour-dusted hands on his face and looked at him like he was the most important thing she'd ever made. Feeling is how you know you're still paying attention. Don't stop paying attention. He had never stopped. Even now, moving through the warm golden hum of Voss and Cole's dining room, tray balanced, vest buttoned, face composed. He was paying attention to everything. The two men near the entrance hadn't moved. Their body language was wrong for customers. Too aligned, too synchronized, weight distributed like they were ready to shift direction fast. One of them had a slight bulge under the left side of his jacket. That was a problem. Near the east side of the room, a server cart had been left at an angle that partially blocked the secondary exit. Ilya wasn't sure if that was careless or intentional. He filed it away. And then table 4. An older man, one of the regulars, was reaching past his wife to retrieve something he'd dropped near the base of his chair. His elbow was about to connect with a full water carafe sitting at the edge of the table. The kind of accident that splashed everywhere, required a full reset, and usually ended with someone embarrassed and someone else cleaning up broken glass from under a chair for 20 minutes. Ilya changed direction, 2 steps faster than his usual pace. He reached table 4 at the exact moment the old man's elbow swung back, caught the carafe with one hand, steadied it without a word, set it 6 inches further from the edge and kept moving. The old man didn't even realize what had almost happened. Good. The best saves were the ones that looked like nothing at all. Ilya circled back toward the service station, and as he did, he let his eyes pass once more over table 7. The triplets hadn't moved dramatically. But something had shifted at that table in the last 20 minutes. Something quiet and cumulative that he couldn't quite define. Like 3 men who had started the evening in one conversation and were now privately having another one entirely. And then one of them looked up. Not at the room. Not at the menu. Not at his brothers. Directly at Ilya. It was Kaler, the one at the head of the table. The one Ilya had whispered to. And the look on his face was not dismissal. Not the flat boredom of a powerful man tolerating service staff. It was attention. Sharp, focused, very still. The look of someone who had just reclassified something from background noise to relevant information. Ilya held his pace perfectly even and turned away. But the back of his neck burned for the rest of the way to the service station. Someone at that table had finally heard him. The question was whether that was going to help or make everything worse. He was not supposed to be at Voss and Cole that night. Ravian Torque had 3 other places he could have been. A private meeting in the Hannam district, a portfolio review his assistant had been rescheduling for 2 weeks, a dinner with an old contact who knew things worth knowing. Any one of those would have been a more productive use of a Tuesday evening for a man whose time was largely spent moving money, reading rooms, and arriving at conclusions before other people had finished forming their questions. But the Dockery triplets had been specifically named in an intelligence brief that had crossed his desk 4 days ago. And when Ravian received intelligence briefs, he preferred to verify them in person rather than through intermediaries. Intermediaries had opinions. In-person observation did not. So he had taken a corner table at Voss and Cole, ordered something he wouldn't finish, and spent the first 40 minutes of the evening doing what he did best. Watching. He watched the triplets arrive. Precise, unhurried, moving with the specific ease of men who expected things to be ready when they got there. He watched the room adjust around them the way all rooms adjusted around power. He watched the staff recalibrate their routes. He watched 2 men near the entrance try very hard to look like they belonged. They didn't belong. Ravian noted that, logged it, kept watching, and then he watched the server. He noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't match its surroundings. Not because it's wrong exactly, but because it's operating by a different set of rules than everything around it. The other servers moved on autopilot, habit-driven, route-programmed. This one moved like every step was a calculation. Like the room was a puzzle he was constantly resolving. And he was pregnant, visibly, carefully, precisely concealed, but not from someone paying real attention. Ravian watched him cross toward table 7. Watched the slight hesitation before he leaned in. Watched the almost imperceptible movement of his mouth. 3 words. Whatever they were, they didn't land. The triplets didn't react. The server straightened up, finished pouring the wine, and turned to walk away. Ravian set down his water glass. Most people in that room had watched the same moment and seen nothing. A server doing his job. A table of important men not paying attention to the help. Standard restaurant theater. Nothing to note. Ravian had seen fear, not incompetence. Not nerves from carrying a difficult pregnancy through a demanding shift. Not anxiety about dropping something expensive in front of powerful people. Fear with a specific object. The kind of fear that says, I know something is wrong and I cannot get anyone to listen. He let 30 seconds pass. Then he stood up, excused himself to no one, and walked toward the restrooms, which happened to require him to pass within 4 feet of table 7. He didn't look at the triplets, didn't pause, didn't slow his pace by a single degree. But as he passed the far side of the table, his left hand dropped to waist height, and his fingers found the underside of the tablecloth's edge. He felt it immediately. Small, flat, warm from contact with the wood, adhered cleanly to the underside of the table base. The profile was familiar in the worst way. He had seen variations of this device in 3 different countries over the past decade, and not one of those contexts had been innocent. Audio capture, possibly transmission, range uncertain from touch alone. Ravian's fingers worked fast. 12 seconds. The adhesion gave way cleanly. He palmed the device without breaking stride, kept walking, pushed through the men's room door, and stood over the sink for a moment looking at what he was holding. Then he turned on the faucet, held the device beneath the water for 15 seconds, dried his hand on the towel, and placed the ruined device in the trash beneath a paper towel where it would not be found by anyone with casual intentions. He washed his hands, looked at himself in the mirror. The server had known, had tried to warn them, had been ignored. Ravian had no particular interest in the Dockery triplets' well-being beyond what it meant for the broader financial situation he was trying to understand. But he had a very strong interest in people who saw real things clearly and got dismissed for it. That particular dynamic had a way of producing consequences nobody planned for. He straightened his jacket and walked back out. The server, Ilya, according to the name card on his vest, was moving toward table 11. He did not look toward the restroom hallway, did not search the room for confirmation that anything had happened. But as Ravian passed him, just for a moment, he saw the young man's shoulders drop by exactly a quarter inch, like something in the room had changed, like some part of him, without knowing why, had registered that the weight was slightly less than it had been 60 seconds ago. Ravian returned to his corner table, picked up his water glass. He did not signal, did not speak, did not look at the server again for the rest of the evening. But he did not stop watching. 3 weeks passed, and in those 3 weeks, nothing dramatic happened to Ilya Rowan. That was almost the worst part. No confrontation, no resolution, no official acknowledgement that the night at Voss and Cole had meant anything at all. He had gone to work the next morning and the morning after that, and the days had folded into each other in that relentless, grinding way that survival days always did. One shift at a time, one aching hour at a time, feet sore, back burning, uniform buttoned all the way up, face composed. The whispers, though, had gotten louder. He wasn't sure how. He hadn't told anyone about the device, hadn't mentioned the warning. But rumors in places like Voss and Cole moved through the staff the way water moved through soil, quietly, invisibly, and then suddenly everywhere. By the end of the second week, he was hearing things that had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with what people were comfortable believing. The pregnant one almost caused a scene with the Dakari table. You hear he has connections? Like actual connections. Shady ones. I don't know why management keeps scheduling him. Liability waiting to happen. He kept his face blank. He kept showing up. Because the electricity in his apartment cost what it cost. Because the prenatal appointments weren't free. Because walking away from the only stable income he had, for the sake of dignity, was a trade that looked a lot more reasonable when you weren't 7 months pregnant and completely alone. So he carried trays. He refilled water glasses. He caught carafes before they fell and reset tables with the kind of invisible precision that good servers develop over years. He did his job the way his mother had taught him to do everything. Fully, carefully, without cutting corners just because nobody was watching. And nobody was watching. Except one person. He didn't know Ravian's name. Didn't know his table number by heart, though the man had returned 4 times in 3 weeks. Always the same corner. Always a single order. Always gone before the dinner rush fully peaked. Ilya had started to notice him the way you notice something consistent in an environment built on inconsistency. Not a regular in the social sense. Not someone who lingered or performed or made himself known. Just present. And occasionally, in ways Ilya couldn't quite explain, helpful. The shift on Wednesday where a tray of glassware had been stacked wrong and should have slid. Didn't, because someone had quietly repositioned the cart while Ilya was handling table 6. The Thursday where a rival server had been quietly spreading a particular story to the manager, and the conversation had inexplicably been interrupted before it landed. Small things. Things that could be coincidence. Things that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Ilya didn't say anything about it to anyone. He had no proof. He had no name. He had only a feeling. Careful and cautious, the way all his feelings had become, that somewhere in the perimeter of his exhausting daily existence, there was a presence that was paying attention. Not to take something from him. Not to use what it found. Just watching. Just there. It was strange how much that mattered. Stranger still that he couldn't decide if it should comfort him or worry him. And then, on the last Friday of the 3rd week, a new variable entered. A family called the Jangose Group had been booking private dining events at Voss and Cole for 6 months. High spenders. Connected. The kind of clients that management treated with specific deference. Their events were always handled by the senior team, never the junior staff, never the servers management considered unstable or uncertain. They had requested Ilya by name for Friday's event. Management had been confused enough to ask twice. Ilya had been confused enough to say yes before he thought it through. By Friday afternoon, as he set up the private dining room and tried to read the situation for what it actually was, he understood one thing clearly. This was not a compliment. He didn't know exactly what it was yet. But the way the senior server had looked at him when he'd passed the corridor. The way 2 of the Jangose family's advanced staff had walked the room twice without explaining why. This was a setup. And he was already inside it. Comment below. If you were in Ilya's position, alone and unheard, what would you have done differently? Would you have kept warning them? Or walked away entirely? The private dining room smelled like money and something else. Something Ilya couldn't name right away. A particular stillness. The kind that precedes a decision that's already been made. He had arrived 30 minutes early, the way he always did. Set the silverware. Aligned the water glasses. Checked the chair positions twice. His hands moved from habit, but his eyes moved from something older and sharper. That quiet, bone-deep instinct that had gotten him through the last 7 months without collapsing. The Jangose event staff had been in the room for 20 minutes before the guests arrived. 2 of them, walking the perimeter slowly, not eating, not talking to each other, just scanning. Ilya had asked them once, politely, if they needed anything. The taller one had looked through him. Not at him, through him. He filed that away. The event itself went smoothly on the surface. 12 guests. Conversation that stayed pleasant and loud. Ilya moved through the room efficiently, refilled glasses, removed plates at the right moment. All the invisible mechanics of a well-run service. No one addressed him directly except to gesture at an empty glass or wave a plate away. And then, just after the second course, he noticed Ravian's corner table. Empty. He almost stopped moving, caught himself, kept walking, reached the service station and stood there for 3 seconds processing what that absence meant. Ravian had been there every week for 3 weeks. Always the corner. Always quiet. Always there in a way that Ilya had, against his own better judgment, started to factor into the room's math without realizing it. Now the table had been reset for the next seating, like he had never sat there. Something tightened in Ilya's chest that he could not afford right now. He pushed it down, made it to the end of the event, cleared the last plates, helped break down the table setup, did everything exactly right. And as the room emptied, as the Jangose family staff collected their things and filtered out, Ilya allowed himself one moment, just one, standing in the empty private dining room with his hand pressed to the small of his back. He was so tired. Not just the physical kind, though that was real and heavy and pressing up behind his eyes. He was tired of making the right call and watching it fall into silence. Tired of seeing things other people missed and being told, through 100 small daily dismissals, that what he saw didn't count. He picked up his bag, walked to the exit, and then, at the employee entrance, in the narrow corridor where the lighting had always been slightly dim, he found an envelope wedged into the corner of his locker door. No name on it. No return address. Just an envelope. His hands didn't shake this time when he opened it. Whatever was coming, he would deal with it. He'd been dealing with everything else. Inside was a single card. Cream-colored. For words. Be careful this week. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No way to know who had written it or when it had been placed there or what, specifically, he was supposed to be careful about. Ilya stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it. Put it in his jacket pocket, walked out into the cold night air of Gangnam, and realized, somewhere between the employee entrance and the street, that the person who had been quietly managing the edges of his danger for 3 weeks was gone. And whatever came next, he was going to face it without that buffer. It happened on a Tuesday, which felt wrong, somehow. The kind of moment that changes everything should at least arrive on a Friday. Give a person the weekend to think. But life doesn't schedule itself around readiness, and what came for Ilya Rowan came fast, and loud, and in front of everyone. He was on the floor during the lunch service, mid-shift, full house, the kind of Tuesday where every table turned twice and the kitchen ran 6 minutes behind and every server moved on compressed time and shortened patience. He had just delivered a correction order to Table 2 when the Jangose family's primary representative, a man named Desmond Kolafwa, sharp suit, sharper expression, walked into Voss and Cole with 3 other people and asked to speak with the manager. Loudly. The kind of loud that made the dining room hush in stages. Table by table, conversation by conversation. Until the only sound was the background hiss of the kitchen and Desmond Kolafwa's voice saying the word breach twice in 30 seconds. Ilya kept moving. Cleared a plate. Refilled a glass. Kept his face arranged correctly. But he heard every word. Security breach during Friday's private event. Sensitive financial documentation, apparently carried on one of the guests' tablets, had been accessed remotely during the dinner. The Jangose group was furious. Management was pale. And Desmond Kolafwa was pointing, not at the room generally, not at the policy, not at the building's security infrastructure. At the server, the pregnant one. The one with the questionable background who had been specifically assigned to the event despite objections from senior staff. The one who moved too carefully, watched the room too closely. The one everybody already had questions about. "We have reason to believe the access point was introduced by a member of your service team," Desmond said, loud enough for the room. "We have identified the individual." Ilya set down his tray, slowly, carefully, on the nearest surface that would hold it. The manager, a man named Gerald Parkowusu who had never once looked Ilya directly in the eye, turned toward him with the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome of a conversation he hadn't yet started. "Ilya, I need you to come with me." The room watched. This was the part nobody prepared you for. Not the accusation itself. Some part of Ilya had felt this coming the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. It was the watching. 12 tables worth of people setting down their forks, angling their bodies, performing the specific human behavior of witnessing something they would later describe to others, making him the story before they knew the facts. He walked to the back office with Gerald. He sat down. He explained, in precise and measured sentences, that he had not introduced anything to that private dining room, that he had arrived early, set up correctly, and served the event without deviation. That the only irregular element he had observed was the behavior of the Jangose advanced staff themselves. 2 individuals who had walked the room's perimeter before guests arrived without identification or explanation. Gerald listened, and then Gerald told him his services were no longer needed. Effective immediately. Ilya stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not cry, though the pressure behind his eyes was real and enormous. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and said, evenly, "You're making a mistake." Gerald didn't answer. Ilya walked back through the kitchen, through the service corridor, past the locker where 4 days ago someone had left him a card with 4 words on it, and out into the afternoon light of Gangnam. He sat down on the curb outside the employee entrance. Just for a moment, his hand went to his stomach. Automatic, steady. The baby moved. Slow and deliberate, like a small fist pressing against the inside of a wall. "I know," Ilya thought. "I know." He sat there for 90 seconds. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and started walking, because behind him, through the restaurant's narrow side window, he had just seen something. A man in a corner of the now rearranged dining room, seated where no customer should have been able to sit during a closed meeting, watching. 11 days later, the truth arrived publicly. Not quietly, not in a private meeting room with carefully worded apologies and handshakes that meant nothing. It arrived the way things that have been held down too long always arrive, fast and hard, and in front of exactly the kind of audience that made the people responsible for it most uncomfortable. The press conference was held at the Gangnam Commerce Center. Neutral ground, technically, but 3 rows from the front, the Dakarai triplets sat in a line. Kaler, Zion, Amari, and the fact that they were there at all meant this was not a routine regulatory disclosure. Ilya stood at the back of the room. He had not been invited. He had seen the conference listed on a public notice board 2 days ago and had written the address on the back of a receipt and carried it in his pocket until today. He wore a coat that didn't button all the way over his stomach anymore, and he had arrived 20 minutes early and found a spot near the wall where he could see the podium without being seen easily. He didn't know what he expected to find here. He just knew he needed to be in the room. The proceedings opened with a representative from the city's Financial Oversight Committee. Dry language, dense legal framing. The kind of presentation that made most of the journalists in the room shift in their seats and check their phones. Ilya watched the triplets instead. Kaler hadn't moved once. That was the thing about Kaler Dakarai that Ilya had noticed from the very first night. The absolute, calibrated stillness of a man who processed information without performing it. Zion was harder to read. Amari looked like a man who was about to say something and was actively deciding not to. And then Ravian Torque walked to the podium. Ilya's breath stopped. Just for 1 second. One complete, total pause, like his body had to decide whether to process this as relief or shock before it could continue functioning. Ravian looked the same, composed. No particular expression. He adjusted the microphone, set a single folder on the podium, and opened it without drama. "On the 3rd of this month," Ravian said, "a member of the service staff at Voss and Cole restaurant identified and attempted to report a surveillance device placed beneath the primary table for that evening's event. The device was placed by contractors affiliated with the Jangose Group's competing investment arm. It was designed to capture financial intelligence from the Dakurai family's private conversations. The room moved, not loudly, but everything shifted. The posture of journalists, the direction of cameras, the specific quality of attention in a space that had just received genuinely new information. The staff member's warning was not acted on. Ravian turned one page in the folder. I removed the device that evening. I have provided documentation of its origin to the appropriate authorities. The Jangose contractor network has been identified. The individual targeted and publicly fired for a breach he did not commit was named Ilya Rowan. His name, in a room full of people, said clearly, without qualification, without apology. Ilya pressed his back against the wall and held very still. He warned them, Ravian said. No one listened. The cameras had turned. Half the room was looking for the person whose name had just been spoken. Scanning rows, checking faces. Ilya stayed exactly where he was. He was not ready to be found yet. He needed one more moment, because across the room, Kaler Dakurai had finally moved. He had turned, not toward the podium, not toward the cameras, but toward the back of the room, like he already knew where to look. And his eyes found Ilya's. It was a brief thing, for seconds, maybe 5. Long enough to be intentional, not long enough to be performance. Then Kaler dipped his head. Not a bow exactly, not dramatic, just a single, deliberate downward motion, the kind a person makes when words aren't enough and they know it. We were wrong. That was what it meant. Ilya knew it the way you know things that don't need to be said out loud. His eyes burned. He blinked twice. He was not going to cry in this room in front of these cameras with his coat that didn't button all the way and his name fresh in the air and 7 months of held breath trying to escape at once. He blinked again. The baby moved. He put one hand over his coat, over the swell of what he was carrying, and he pressed lightly. And he let himself feel for one moment what it was like to be believed. Not rescued, not fixed, believed. Outside the conference room, the legal machinery was already starting. The Jangose contractors would be named in formal proceedings. Voss and Cole would be investigated. Desmond Kolaf's public statement would be dissected in courtrooms for months. There was still a long road. He knew that. But inside the room, Ravian Torque was still at the podium. And Ilya could not stop looking at him. This man who had removed a device in 12 seconds and disappeared and then showed up 11 days later to say his name out loud in front of the city. Why? That question did not have an answer yet. And not having the answer, after everything, felt like the most important thing left to find. The hardest thing about being believed, when it finally happens, is that it doesn't undo what came before it. The weeks of the whispers don't dissolve. The shift where Gerald Parkawusu's expression had already reached its verdict before the conversation began. That doesn't rewind. The moment on the curb outside the employee entrance, hand on his stomach, 90 seconds of trying to stay together, that stays. Stays exactly as it was. Ilya understood this. He was sitting at a small table in a cafe 3 blocks from the Gangnam Commerce Center. Coffee he hadn't drunk going cold in front of him, when he fully let himself understand it. Vindication was not the same as healing. It was important. It was necessary. It mattered in all the ways that public record and cleared names and formal documentation of the truth mattered. He was not minimizing it. He would not. Ravian had spoken his name in a room full of people and Kaler Dakurai had bowed his head and those things were real and they had weight. But they were not the thing his mother had been talking about when she'd said, "You are not weak because you feel." The strength she had meant was quieter than vindication, less visible. It was the kind that had gotten Ilya through Tuesday mornings and back-to-back shifts and a chorus of daily dismissals that had tried, collectively, to convince him that what he saw wasn't real, that what he knew wasn't worth saying out loud, that the right thing to do, when everyone around you has decided you're the wrong person in the wrong place, is to go quietly. He had not gone quietly. He had whispered 3 words. And he had kept showing up every morning after that. That was the part nobody had photographed. Nobody had documented. Nobody was going to name in a press conference. The 11 days between being fired and having his name cleared, those 11 days of waking up anyway and making decisions about what kind of person he was going to be, those belonged entirely to him. And he was not going to let anyone take them. Outside the cafe window, the city moved at its usual pace. Cars and people and the low background hum of a place that didn't particularly care whether any individual life had just righted itself or broken entirely. Gangnam was like that, magnificent and indifferent in equal measure. Ilya picked up the coffee cup, set it back down. He thought about Ravian, the question of why. Why a man like that had removed a device and stayed silent about his own role and then, 11 days later, walked to a podium and spoken, was one Ilya hadn't been able to stop turning over. It wasn't a debt. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like something that had its own logic he hadn't been given access to yet. Maybe he would be, maybe not. He was a person who was starting to understand that not every question resolves cleanly. Some things happen and you carry them without a full explanation and they become part of the structure of who you are. From 2 tables over, a woman with a sleeping toddler on her shoulder glanced at Ilya, at the hand he'd placed on his stomach, and gave him the small, exhausted, completely genuine smile of someone who recognized the particular weight of carrying something important. Ilya smiled back. It was small, but it was real. And outside, past the cafe window, past the moving city, the Jangose group was quietly and furiously preparing its next response to the morning's events. Lawyers were on phones. Statements were being drafted. There were people in that network who were not finished with this situation. Ilya didn't know that yet, but somewhere in him, the part that had always paid attention, the part his mother had shaped into a compass, something was already waiting. Quiet, still, ready. He finished the cold coffee, stood up, walked out into the afternoon. 3 weeks after the press conference, Ilya moved to a smaller apartment 2 neighborhoods east of Gangnam. Not because he had to, because he wanted to, because the place he had been living carried the specific weight of a chapter he was finished with, and he was ready, carefully, without rushing, to start the work of what came next. The new apartment had a window above the kitchen sink that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made even plain things look like they meant something. He had stood at that sink the first morning, washing a single cup, watching the light move across the counter, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief, something quieter, safety, not the absence of threat. He was too clear-eyed for that kind of thinking now. He knew there were still people connected to the Jangose network who were angry and looking for leverage and not particularly interested in what the morning's press conference had established. He knew legal processes were long and imperfect and that cleared names didn't automatically clear circumstances. He knew all of that. But safety, the real kind, wasn't the same as certainty. It was the feeling of being grounded enough in yourself that the uncertain things couldn't reach the center of you. His mother had lived that way, had raised him in it, even when their circumstances had been tight and unpredictable, and there had been more weeks than not where the edges of their life had felt frayed. She had stood at her own kitchen sink, flour-dusted hands, late light, and she had been present, fully, deliberately present. Ilya was learning that again. He had received formal documentation of his reinstatement. Not at Voss and Cole, which had offered a terse written apology and a settlement that his new attorney had called insufficient. But his record was cleared. His name was clean. The evidence was on file. He was not going back. Something better was coming. He couldn't see its full shape yet, but he felt its direction the way you feel the difference between still air and moving air even before you can name it. Ravian had sent a message 9 days after the press conference. Short, direct, requesting, if Ilya was open to it, a conversation. Not an apology. Not an explanation. A conversation, his word. On Ilya's terms. At Ilya's chosen location. Ilya had not responded yet. He wasn't avoiding it. He was simply not ready, and he had decided, somewhere between the press conference and this new apartment and this kitchen sink, that he was allowed to move at his own pace now. He had spent a very long time operating on everyone else's timeline, adjusting his schedule to what the room needed, what the shift required, what survival demanded. He could take a few more days. The baby was due in 7 weeks. 7 weeks. It was the kind of countdown that reorganized everything around it. Every decision, every morning, every moment of quiet into a preparation. And Ilya found that he didn't mind it. Found that the weight of what he was carrying had shifted in his perception from burden to purpose in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. He was going to be a parent. That was still the realest thing. That evening, he stood at the window of the new apartment and watched the city lights come on. One by one, across the Gangnam skyline. Buildings going amber in the dusk. The low, moving river of headlights on the main road below. The specific sound that a city makes when it shifts from day to night. Not quieter, exactly, just different. He had survived this. All of it. The whispers and the dismissals and the Tuesday that had ended his job and the 11 days after that and the moment in a press conference where a man he didn't fully understand had said his name out loud to the world. He had survived. And he was choosing, carefully, consciously, the same way he had always made his best choices. Not to let survival be the ceiling. Not to call endurance the same thing as living. His mother had not raised him to be a person who simply made it through. She had raised him to be a person who, once through, turned around and decided what came next. He pressed one hand to the window glass. Cold. Solid. Real. I survived, he said quietly, to the city, to the light, to the small presence pressing gently against his ribs like a question waiting to be answered. And I will not break again. The city kept moving below him, and for the first time in a very long time, so did he. This story is for every person who has ever been in a room where they knew the truth and no one listened. If it moved you, share it. Let someone else who needs it find it. And if you have a story of your own, about endurance, about being believed, about holding together when everything was pushing you apart, drop it in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else is waiting to read. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Every week, stories about people who held on when holding on was the hardest thing, and what happened when they did.